It's going to be over. Huh? I'd like to welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone back. I'd like to welcome everyone back to this closing session of Investigating the Mind. As you know, this session will be somewhat different from the previous sessions, whereas in the previous sessions we had chosen a particular theme, be it attention, mental imagery, or emotion, and we spoke about that theme with some care concerning both the theoretical, experimental, and experiential dimensions from the standpoint of Western science, from the standpoint of Buddhism. This session, by contrast, is one in which we're going to step back. We're going to, as it were, take stock of those diverse opinions and findings of the previous two sessions, and we're going to try to think synthetically and ask some of the large questions that cut across our previous opportunities to explore these themes together. To help us do this, we've asked back onto the stage all the presenters, as well as Evan Thompson and Ajahn Amaro. But we've also asked two individuals who have great skill, we believe, in doing just this kind of task, of stepping back and asking the larger questions. The first is Professor Eric Lander, who is 2 seats away from Anne. There he is. Professor Lander is an internationally known molecular biologist. He's working at MIT, at the Whitehead Institute, and at the New Broad Institute. Together with him, we've asked Harvard professor Jerome Kagan. Jerry is a very distinguished statesman, you could say, in science, and especially known for his work in developmental psychology. They bring not only long experience in their own scientific disciplines, but you could say long experience in working in complex interdisciplinary fields. And so we hope they will help us form this big picture. They'll be each giving about a 20-minute overview and set of questions. And what we've asked them to do is to speak to us about what they've seen, what they valued, but also we've asked them, and this is entirely, I think, within the keeping of the Buddhist spirit of inquiry and critical inquiry and debate, to speak also concerning the hard questions, the questions where they see differences, the challenges that they would like to present to this dialogue. Are we making it too easy? Are there things we really need to bear in mind? Now, there will then follow a conversation amongst the panelists here that will unfortunately not be as long as each of us wished. Already downstairs over lunch, we were fully engaged in that conversation. You're lucky you got us up here at all. And as a consequence of our needing to close early enough to give time for closing remarks, some substantial closing remarks by His Holiness, and other closing details, we're going to have to end around 3:15. What this has meant is what we're going to have to do is in some ways fold your questions as they've already been given to us, your concerns, into the questions which we raise, and we think they will be folded in a way that will accommodate what it is that's living already in the audience. And so with that, I'd like to begin our conversation together with a presentation by Eric.
Screwed up. I made it. Good. Well, thank you very much, Arthur, Your Holiness, everyone here on the stage and in the audience. I have no idea what I'm doing here. I bring no experience whatsoever in Buddhism. I'm not a Buddhist and not intimately familiar with Buddhist teachings. And I am also not a mind scientist, not a neurobiologist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I am rather a geneticist on the faculty at MIT, and my only qualification is that I am completely unqualified in both of the disciplines in order to make any technical comments about substance. It is for that reason that the organizers asked me to serve more as a member of the audience, as a listener, to reflect and try to integrate on what I've heard. Another reason why they asked me as opposed to you, although anyone who would like to come up and do it, there's still an opportunity, is that I had the honor to spend a week in Dharamshala last October at the invitation of His Holiness for another meeting on a different subject, the nature of life, more about molecular biology and physics and philosophy and ethics. And it was a truly remarkable experience that I think perhaps they thought might help me to listen in the course of this remarkable weekend. But I ask you to bear with me because it's a bit intimidating to try to summarize and integrate. My first reflection is very easy, though. What a remarkable 2 days this has been. I am sure that I speak for the audience in saying this, that this has been an extraordinary experience and a privilege that we have had to listen in on this remarkable and broad conversation. So I want to say to all of the organizers, thank you. Now, I will try to integrate what I've heard, and I have organized it under 5 points. The first, what are the foundations for any kind of a dialogue between different traditions? I think that first foundation is a commitment to openness, to debate, to evidence, to a non-dogmatic approach, and to respect. What does it really mean to be open? It means being willing to change your mind and say, you might be wrong. I will tell very briefly what I found to be a remarkable conversation in Dharamsala in October about a subject having nothing to do with the mind. It was a discussion we were having to do about embryonic stem cells, a very complicated subject in this country. And it led us to the question of, at what point an embryonic stem cell or an 8-cell embryo might be a human being? And we all debated back and forth. And it was offered from the Buddhist perspective that the Abhidharma mentions that through the meeting of 2 regenerative substances of the mother and the father, consciousness enters and the being then becomes sentient, from which you might reason that the being becomes a sentient immediately at fertilization, and that there would therefore be very serious problems with working with such a cell. And that was the opening position, the opening thought. And as more scientific discussion went back and forth about this point, it emerged that, yes, but if you took embryos and separated the cells, you got 2 people, not 1. And if you implanted an embryo, there was no guarantee that you would even get a single person. You might get none, because most embryos spontaneously abort. And so maybe it wasn't so simple. And maybe, in fact, and it was just a remarkable moment for me as a scientist hearing the Buddhists and His Holiness discussing this, maybe, in fact, there was a different interpretation there, and maybe there was no negative karma associated with experimentation at that point. No firm decisions were made, no commitments were made, but the openness to consider those things, I must say, in this country, it would be wonderful if we could have discussions as open as that. Now, it's not enough for the Buddhists to be open to rethinking. Science also must be open to rethinking. Now, at its best, science is about constantly being in doubt, and it is about a constant humility about how little we know. Although in practice, day to day, that humility doesn't always come out. We sometimes take positions that can seem, and in fact are, very dogmatic. The brain can't change, it doesn't grow new neurons or something. When pressed, we know that that's not true, but we have to constantly remind ourselves as scientists, we might be wrong about all of these points, and it is the evidence that decides. That is the first basis of any open dialogue, is a willingness to change our minds, the willingness to be susceptible to evidence. A second important part of a dialogue is to understand the motivation that we bring to any dialogue. Not that we must have the same motivation, but that we should understand the motivations. There too, a brief story from my visit to Dharamsala. My colleague Stephen Chu, a physicist who has now gone into biophysics, asked, is it okay to do animal experimentation? I'm doing some with collaborators. Is it wrong? And His Holiness gave just a remarkable answer that has stuck with me. He said, it's not that simple. I can't say right or wrong. There's clearly bad karma associated with killing an animal in an experiment. But 2 other points. What will be the outcome 50 years from now? Will it be good outcome that has come from this? Will it have a positive benefit on the world? I could just about get that, because that's a Western notion of a benefit in a cost-benefit analysis. But then the third point was very interesting. He said, and the other point that figures is what's in your heart in doing the experiment? What is your deep motivation? Quite apart from any long-term consequences. This was one, I confess, we don't talk about as much in the laboratory, and few institutional review boards reviewing experiments have the question, explain what is in your heart in doing this experiment. We wouldn't even know how to deal with that question there, and yet it clearly matters a great deal. And so it's worth asking, what are our motivations? Not just with respect to one's karma, depending on whether one believes or does not believe in that framework, but what are your motivations that you bring to any investigations and any dialogue? I think there are 2 motivations that are clear here. Both science and Buddhism bring a motivation to ameliorate suffering in the world. I think that's clear. They attempt to do it in very different ways. To ameliorate suffering primarily through a mental process, primarily through a physical process, but there's some of both in each. In addition, there's another motivation that's quite different. Many scientists are motivated by pure curiosity, and many of the things they do in the lab are really driven by a curiosity about the world. One thing that I think I've heard also in listening to the Buddhist scholars, that they too share that curiosity. That yes, there is a deep and abiding motivation to ameliorate suffering in the world, but there is also a purely intellectual curiosity about the world that they've been thinking about. And there's a meeting ground on both of those things. And the experiments will involve both outcome and benefit to the world, and satisfying a curiosity for 2 traditions that have been thinking for a long time. So that's a foundation for some dialogue. Now, what can Buddhist scholars bring to scientific investigation of the mind? I have several possibilities of what they might bring, and I see different advantages and disadvantages to each of these. One, they bring interesting experimental participants with highly trained skills. Mathieu Ricard, my colleague in particular, has offered himself in these studies and has worn all of these wonderful, this headdress there, and comes out of the MRI after 3 hours smiling, although Mathieu always comes out smiling, I think, no matter. But these studies are quite remarkable, and I think Professor Davidson's work really shows how much science can learn by studying a highly trained, skilled experimental participant. And that there is a difference between highly trained participants and college undergraduates at $10 an hour. But that's only one small slice of what Buddhist scholars can bring. They bring traditional practices that have been worked out based on experimentation and careful thought over some 2,500 years. How should we regard such traditional practices? But one way is to regard them something like a folk wisdom, the way that pharmaceutical companies might regard a folk remedy or something. They're on to something, and now we'll come and really work out what the basis of it is. I don't think that's the right way to regard it. I would suggest, and I am persuaded, that we have every reason to regard it as a refined technology, that technology plays a critical role in science. Now, the Buddhist tradition is not a technology for detection, like an MRI machine, but it is a technology for modulation, and those are very valuable in science. We at MIT right now are very excited about a new technology called RNAi that can modulate genes in cells because of all the ways it's going to let us probe how cells work. I too think there is evidence of a technology, not just the notion that the brain is adaptable, that it might be possible to train attention, train emotion, but actually specific protocols suggesting how you might do so. We should value very highly technologies for doing things because they are very hard to come by. They take very long times to work out, and there's something very valuable there. Now, I should say, Western tradition has also recently developed, apparently, technologies for training the mind in powerful ways. I refer specifically to the discussions of the video game that apparently has these effects on attention, but as has been pointed out here, it's only part of the whole picture. They seem to lack, through the video game training, the aspects of relaxation, meta-awareness, and mindfulness. Whatever it is, I'm not totally sure, but I'm reasonably sure the kids playing video games aren't having that. And this ability to multitask calmly, which I, for one, would very much like to know how to do. Now, another possibility that Buddhist scholars might bring to investigation is specific explanations of brain mechanisms, how things really work in the underlying physical substrate of the brain. And the Buddhist tradition has its theories, and it has its explanations, and we've heard descriptions of 6 awarenesses, 51 mental factors, genuine happiness, compassion, joyful effect. I'm not sure that I believe that the specific descriptions of mechanism will prove that fruitful, because I'm not sure that introspection can point us to mechanism per se. But I should note here, I am equally suspicious of the same Western ideas that have emerged about how the mind is organized from introspection. I think, in fact, we need other ways to study how the mind is organized. And people here will be able to say much more, but I'm not sure that either of the two traditions will be able to bring explanations, and that is mostly because I think we are still very far away from mechanism. The work of the next decades, I think, is to explore much more richly the phenomena themselves, the phenomenology. Let's get those described well. And I think maybe then, as a molecular biologist, I know we cannot describe mechanisms unless we're pretty close to it. A description of how cells divide 10 steps removed doesn't help much. So I would focus on this phenomenology. But that said, these well-worked-out traditions do bring something very important. They bring distinct perspectives that inspire ideas and questions. And sometimes too much is made in science about the technology or the data. One of the most important things in science are what questions you're asking. People who come and bring new questions to science often revolutionize fields simply because they pose the question differently. And there we have a tremendous amount to learn by the dialogue between fields. Buddhism does propose different ways to parse the world. 6 awarenesses, 51 mental factors. Western science proposes different ways to parse mental abilities. These taxonomies differ. They're probably, I hope I get in no trouble, both wrong at some level. But nonetheless, the fact that you have 2 of them that are that don't map onto each other is very valuable. They also bring specific constructs to investigate. I don't routinely think about, as Alan has talked about, stability and vividness of images. Yet they talk an awful lot about that, and it must mean something, and we've got to come to understand what that stability and vividness is about. Also notice that both sides have brought different metaphors, sometimes based on their cultures. We bring a metaphor on the Western side here of the CEO in charge of the brain, the executive in charge of the brain. And I'm told by my colleagues on the other side that the Buddhists have a metaphor of a very weak king with continual palace coups going on all the time.
生中兩部就錯別見嘅，
And these are different, and they are rooted in their culture. And because they're rooted in the culture, they're not right because of that, but they're different, and that's valuable. Now, I note, it isn't exclusive to Buddhism. Marvin Minsky here and others at MIT speak about the society of mind, of a sort of chaos of a society, which, if you live in the university world, is something that feels very, reasonable and comfortable compared to, say, in a corporation. We have brought different perspectives on what is fixed and what is changeable, what is trainable. The idea that we should think about, say, emotion, not just as a state or as an unchanging trait, but as a skill that can be trained. That is an assumption that overturns some of the usual way we think about things, and I think will prove to be very important. It raises the question of how trainable is it? How generalizable is the training? And I hope the panel will talk about that. And in addition, I believe it was Alan who said an example of different goals that the Buddhist perspective has brought. Namely, in the Western perspective, we focus on mental illness and try to get to normality, be a normal mental state. But Alan asked, well, why stop there? What about the upper end of mental health? Olympic status of mental health? I think it is a very interesting question. Why are we satisfied just to say you're not mentally ill? Why is it not, like exercise, something that one could get better and better at? There's nothing wrong, nothing of this conflicts with science. We just don't happen to say these things that often to ourselves. And so because they bring different perspectives, I think they're of great value. The third point, what are the most fruitful areas for collaboration? I challenge our scientists and our Buddhist scholars to think specifically. To deliver on the promise of this will require specific research agendas. They will require specific testable hypotheses, testable experiments. I hope to hear more about them. I was excited to hear Richard Davidson's experiments with just beautiful data there. There's a little of it. We need lots more of it for many more people. I think an important theme of this research agenda, in my unqualified opinion, is to connect more this first-person experience with the third-person observables. I think the MRI is a powerful technique for doing that. It, in some sense, connects, validates each in each other's terms. I think the panel will talk about the differences in the status of first-person and third-person observations that figure in both traditions. But I think that being able to say, Mathieu says, compassion corresponds to a portion of the brain lighting up. If that goes on enough and enough, I think it will have a powerful impact on the way we are able to do science, do design experiments, and understand things. And I'd even go further. I would like to see the assertions about enhanced faculties be tested in very concrete ways. I am impressed by the assertions about attention. They seem, from all the discussion, quite reasonable. But they ought to be susceptible not just to these MRI tests, but to many psychological, psychophysical tests. And here, I wonder if, in fact, the Buddhists might do a better job of designing those psychological tests to show what it is they feel they can do well, that they have trained to do well. The psychologists have designed a bunch of tests from their context, but some of them seem a little stilted. I mean, the map was interesting, can you find the beach from the house? But I don't know if that's the best way to actually, get at these things. And it might be, nothing wrong with that. But I think it would be very interesting to ask the Buddhists, you feel you can do something extraordinarily well, design a test that you think that will show that and distinguish trained practitioners from untrained practitioners. I think that research agenda would just be incredibly important to taking this discussion to the next level. Fourth, what can Buddhist scholars gain from such a collaboration? Well, we've heard several answers. Using modern scientific methods, the Buddhist scholars may get answers to old questions. His Holiness referred to this old debate about how physical objects are represented as mental objects. Is it a one-to-one mapping? Is it a many-to-one mapping? Is it a one-to-many mapping? That was what I took the cutting the egg question as. And the Buddhist answer after 2,000 years is, they don't know, and they'd like to. So there is a curiosity that might produce contributions to these debates and questions. Other answers of what Buddhism might gain, it has been raised by some, perhaps they might be able to further improve contemplative techniques. They have been improved over 2,000 years, but as with all things, it is likely that the more you know about them, it may be able to make them better, to get the sort of feedback of how a student is doing. There is the potential that science will, quote, validate claims, although that's always very risky because one does not want to stake the validity of one's belief system on some other set of measurements, but there's something there. And then in some ways the most deep explanation that I've talked to many of the panelists about that comes back again and again is what can Buddhist scholars gain? Simply benefit for the world, benefit for others, which I think is quite a remarkable thing. And I think if I were to ask what is the primary reason most of the Buddhist scholars would say that they are participating, it is for that reason, that they think such a program will lead to benefit for others. Lastly, what can the world gain? Well, several things. Specific knowledge about the mind, the brain. These are very challenging questions. We need all the help we can get. But I think there are some other things the world can gain. And I'll speak here as a scientist, concerned somewhat about our society. We live in a world in which science is a very powerful and effective paradigm. And yet, we know it does not contain all the answers to all human needs. Like any one-dimensional diet, consuming only science leads to malnutrition. But the fact that science does not contain the answer to all human needs has produced in many people, in our country at least, what some have called a flight from reason, a rejection of science, an appeal of fantastical things. Forgive me for those who I may offend, pyramids and crystals and things. Sorry, but we're supposed to make some trouble. What I think is remarkable about this debate is that I think there is a big difference here. This has not been about any flight from reason or flight from science. It has said that it is possible for science and Buddhism to recognize happily that science is only one way of understanding the world. It can be incorporated, it can be worked with, it need not be rejected. And I think that is a really important thing. I think our world would be much better with these sorts of debates that are based on respect and an attempt to understand. And I think science needs very much to be willing to participate in those debates because it has much to offer the world, but not everything to offer the world. And finally, in the long run, what might society gain? Well, we may actually help to alleviate human suffering. The U.S. Surgeon General advises at least 60 minutes of physical exercise 5 times a week. It's not inconceivable that 10 or 20 years from now, the U.S. Surgeon General might recommend 60 minutes of mental exercise 5 or 6 times a week. So in closing, it has been extraordinary to watch 2 great traditions in our world, fashioned over centuries in the case of science, millennia in the case of the Buddhist tradition, come together in the form of people of goodwill and good heart, and to come for this open dialogue. For me, as I suspect for so many of you here, it has been a privilege to listen, and we are all enriched by it.
Very nice. Beautiful. Beautiful.
And Great wrap up. And Jerry's got a tough act to follow there. He's going to do it.
He needs an encore.
And he's going to be critical, so it'll be tough. I hope he doesn't get hurt feelings.
Your Holiness, ladies and gentlemen, I think the directors and the others were wise to have us paired this way because my comments do follow, I think, in a coherent manner from Eric's wonderful presentation. I, too, applaud the wisdom and the courage, not only of His Holiness, but the Mind and Life Institute for this extraordinary meeting and its very rich dialogue. I apologize to you for reading my comments, but with only 20 minutes and too much to say, I think staying close to the text keeps me restrained. I can get garrulous, and hopefully will render what I want to say a little bit more coherent. I want to address two very distinct issues. The first asks why this meeting was oversubscribed so quickly. I'm suggesting that this would not have occurred 50 years ago when Americans were so confident and smug because the good guys beat the bad guys and everything was very clear. An answer to that question requires a historical analysis. The second question is more pointed, and it asks whether the trained Buddhist introspections can add substantially to our understanding of the human psyche. I'll deal first with the suggestion that the popularity of this meeting is a result of the nature of the social changes that have occurred over the last century, and those changes have affected our assumptions about human nature. The new descriptions of humans that emerged in Europe when the medieval era blended into the Renaissance, you'll remember, were due to profound changes in political and economic structures. And the changes that occurred half a millennia later during the Enlightenment required scientific and mathematical advances and Luther's very bold successive challenge to the authority of the Vatican. I suggest to you that from the Enlightenment to World War I, most members of Western society did not question the ultimate truth of the following three propositions. One, humans possess a free will that permits each individual to decide what to believe and what acts to implement or to suppress. Therefore, each person must assume responsibility when they violate a moral norm. I remind you that free will was a very popular 19th century idea, and in every text in American libraries in the 19th century you can find that term. And of course, we've been told this notion of the mind able to control its emotions is central to Buddhist philosophy, as Professor Dreyfus noted this morning. Two, although our basic sensory and motor abilities and our physiology are inherited and therefore very difficult to change, the content of our thoughts, our emotions, and our cultural institutions, they're created constructions that lie far beyond the reach of our genome and could not be predicted from human biology. Three, although humans inherit a biological bias that permits them to feel anger, jealousy, selfishness, and envy, and to be rude, aggressive, or violent, they inherited an even stronger biological bias for kindness, compassion, cooperation, love, and nurture, especially toward those in need, because an ethical sense is a biological feature of our species. And you know that this is the Buddhist premise, and I can assure you, as a student of children for 40 years, developmental psychology affirms the validity of that claim. A thought experiment is persuasive. I want each of you to estimate right now the total number of opportunities for any individual today across the world to commit an asocial act. Aggression, murder, rape, rudeness, dishonesty, robbery, with complete certainty that they will never be discovered or punished. Put that very large number in the denominator, and in the numerator, place the number of those asocial acts that actually will occur today. That ratio is close to 0 every day of the year. And if you place in the numerator the number of benevolent acts, leaving in the denominator the number of malevolent ones, that ratio is positive every day. Thus, the human chimera is more lamb than lion. Even though there have been brief intervals when philosophers, especially European ones, were uncertain about that truth. For example, Thomas Hobbes was much more pessimistic. But the Buddhist premise that we are more strongly biased to be benevolent rather than malevolent is probably a true feature of our species. And most of you are here because you need support for that belief, because we've lived through a period when recent history threatened that idea. And that happened because history's muse woke from her slumbers and, bored with the status quo, decided to stir the pot and see what new scenarios she might create. First, she arranged for new migrations in the middle of the last century that further diversified America and Europe at a time when the economy had changed and the labor of new migrants was not as necessary as it had been a half century earlier in the late 19th century. As a result, vocational and class mobility were stalled, and too many youth of immigrant families could not ascend easily into middle-class status. Because of that frustration, the muse arranged for a raising of our consciousness and guilt over prejudices toward these new citizens. Those changes were prophetic because they required that the privileged minority acknowledge the dignity and validity of the values of the minority, and as a result, inevitably, to begin to question the truth of their own moral imperatives. As a result, many became uncertain about the meaning of sin and sacrament. The problem with that doubt is that humans find it very difficult to cope with that ambiguity. For once any one of us begins to lose our unquestioned faith in the moral veracity of the beliefs we acquire during childhood, we become unsure of the goals we should commit to, and that mood is especially toxic to youth. Moreover, the new moral imperatives for understanding and tolerance and allowing the less fortunate to enhance their sense of virtue required all of us, our society, to select a goal that all might attain with effort, and one that did not impugn the disadvantaged minority. Unfortunately, gaining wealth and gaining status fit that requirement, for neither is a personal feature like ethnicity, skin color, national origin, or gender, which 19th century Americans and Europeans used to reassure themselves. But that choice of wealth and status transformed American society from well-socialized pit bulls to solitary stalking wolves. Humans do not like being wolves. Dramatic advances in molecular biology, genetics, and neuroscience were the muse's final intervention. A small group, but especially vocal scientists, declared that the public made a mistake in exaggerating the power of human will, in the infinite possibilities of culture, and essential human benevolence. And they had to acknowledge, we had to acknowledge the powerful but unfelt biological biases that were inherent in our biology. Those historical events which led many to question whether there was sin, free will, and the need to restrain self-interest, to subdue ego, as Professor Dreyfus said, threatened many who reflected on the implications of this new form of Calvinistic predestination. But this time, instead of being born in sin, with future descent to hell determined, the public was being told that they had the illusion that they were free to decide when and where to nurture or attack, when in truth, the anatomy and chemistry of their brain, partly given by genes, partly acquired, they were the real executive directors of their daily actions. Given that state of affairs, none of us should be surprised that many Americans and Europeans became eager for any scientific evidence or philosophical argument that could challenge this dark, materialistic, amoral view of human nature. Buddhist philosophy is one form a bold David might assume in a battle with the twin-headed Goliath of biological determinism and the uncomfortable tension that accompanies the daily need to be competitive, self-interested, and suspicious of the intentions of others, rather than concerned with one's community, one's neighbors, as if we recognized the correctness of John Donne's famous lines, "Do not ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." The welcome Buddhist view claims that joy and serenity are not slavishly tied to our physiology, because humans are not objects manipulated by biological forces, but active participants in control of the generation of their own thoughts and emotions. The Buddhists say you must treat the human mind as a coherent whole, rather than as a set of separate modular parts. A crimson sunset, not a collection of dust particles reflecting the dying sun's photons. The Buddhists agree that one cannot understand the human mind by analyzing it into its separate components without any value constraints, which scientific habits dictate. Because humans, unlike any other animal, reflect on their past and its relation to the present, and are influenced not only by sensations, but more often by their notions of right and wrong and the ideal. Humans are first and foremost ethical animals. That's a scientific statement, not a philosophical statement. They're ethical animals who, unlike any other species, automatically evaluate experience as good or bad, right or wrong. I want you all to remember your applause yesterday when a Buddhist scholar said that an ethical stance penetrates every meditation. Most scientists, not all, do not know how to deal with that claim. Nature is value-free. Just the facts, no value judgments. When hyenas kill lovely gazelles, or Hutu murder Tutsi, we should understand that this is all consonant with the Darwinian principle for maximal fitness of each individual. No one has explained in a satisfactory way why West and East constructed such different conceptions of nature. Here's a suggestion, probably worth half a penny. It begins by noting that the mind is always attracted to places where there is a great deal of variation. I have the intuition that the ancient Sumerians, Hebrews, and Greeks were more impressed with the variety in human physical appearance, mores, and languages than with the variety in nature. And therefore, they attended to humans and made the individual the primary entity, The language and mores of the ancient Alexandrians appeared to the Athenians to be qualitatively, not just quantitatively distinct. By contrast, the ancient Chinese saw greater variety in nature than in humans, because wind velocity, temperature, and storms are perceptually graded events that wax and wane. They invented the complementary forces of yin and yang, rather than posit qualitatively separate, bounded material things. I'm suggesting to you that the Buddhist premises are appealing not only to me, but to probably all of you, because they're effective weapons we can use against those who wish to reduce human psychology to neurons, transmitters, and protein receptors, programmed to push all of us to look out for self first. I have some neuroscientist friends I respect and play tennis with who assume, and we've stopped arguing, they assume that eventually the following statement, quote, Mary felt afraid when she saw the spider on her bed, close quote, that one day that statement will be replaced with, quote, there was increased synchrony of neural firing at 4 to 8 cycles per second in the lateral amygdala and the hippocampus after Mary's thalamus and visual cortex registered the small black form on the white surface. That was not meant to make you laugh. Thus, an important reason for the popularity of this meeting is that most of you, and those who couldn't come, were feeling that historical events over which you had no control had deformed your basic urges, and you were hungry for philosophical support for what your intuitions told you were true. Now for my second question. In addressing this issue, it is necessary to distinguish between the philosophical assumptions of Buddhism and the method of trained introspection. The primary purpose of this meeting was to consider whether individuals trained in the Buddhist form of introspection could discover significant facts about the human mind that no other method could reveal. And second, whether those facts had a special or privileged access to what was true. This separation is important because I noted that Buddhist philosophy has an ethical foundation, but true facts about nature are very often inconsistent with ethical premises. That is a profound insight that Wittgenstein and others understood very well. Now, you will notice for the rest of this talk that I'm focusing on the empirical facts about mind that introspection can uncover. I am not talking about the therapeutic value of introspection for the person seeking a more serene, compassionate state. Those are very different uses of meditation and introspection. We're talking about the first. Although the Buddhists contend that specially trained introspection can reveal deep truths about the human mind that Ritchie's EEG or fMRI scanner could never discover, I remind you, and I guess I'm revealing who's a hero for me, I remind you of Niels Bohr, the great Danish physicist, when he suggested that no method has a uniquely privileged power to reveal the true nature of the human mind or the true nature of anything. Whether you record neuronal activity, behavior, latencies in a priming experiment, or the products of trained introspection. Each method reveals something different about the whole, and we need a variety of procedures to come closer to answers that, of course, we will never possess. There are two reasons for this you might regard as pessimistic claim. First, There is a wealth of robust scientific evidence to demonstrate that some biological events, and I think Nancy Kamwisher and Steve Kosslin mentioned this, that some biological events in principle are not accessible to awareness, even trained awareness. But those events influence our feelings and actions. For example, if adults are told to listen carefully to a series of ba sounds, ba, 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 and to report when they perceive any change, they fail to detect consciously a slight physical variant of that sound. But their brain does, even if they're sleeping. And it produces a very clear waveform in their EEG. Every time any one of us sees a friend or spouse or a colleague the first time in the morning, a brief autonomic reaction occurs that is completely unavailable to awareness. More important, the results of every method have a special form and are described with a special metric. The metric that communicates the products of trained introspection to others consists of categories, usually, but not always, semantic. These semantic forms, language if you will, are simply not fine enough to capture bodily events that occur in milliseconds in parts of brain that are permanently hidden from the light of introspection. Trained introspection is a lens with a fixed curvature. The lens can be polished, the lens can be cleaned to make the perception more accurate, but unfortunately its focal length is fixed. A serious problem for the trained introspectionist is that in order to communicate their insights to others, they use words. But sadly, words were not invented to describe these very private perceptions and sensations. Words were invented by Homo sapiens to describe categories of things in the world, animals, food, objects, people, and their movements, or to instruct people as to how to behave. And most of these things that are described by words, neuroscientists tell us, are mediated by a circuit involving the thalamus and the dorsal areas of the cortex. Words represent large, boundary, rough-hewn events that either stay still or move at a slow pace. Words are the worst possible vehicle to communicate private sensations, which are mediated not by the thalamus and the dorsal areas of the cortex, but by the hypothalamus and the medial areas of the cortex. In other words, in our evolution separated these two sources of information. The task of describing most private experiences can be likened to reaching down into a deep well to pick up small, fragile crystal figures while you're wearing thick leather mittens. So even if the trained introspectionist were able to pierce the veil that hides the fast-moving, subtle changes that occur in brain and body, that person will have enormous difficulty sharing that information with others. Perhaps nature wanted these feelings to remain secret, locked in each agent's sense of his being. I want each of you to reflect for a moment on the gap between the taste sensations that accompany eating French chocolate at the end of the day when you're very hungry and your linguistic account of that experience. Even Marcel Proust would have a hard time. Recall Professor Wallace saying yesterday, well, there's a special state. You are aware that you are aware. To elaborate that feeling is almost impossible with words. The writer Julia Blackburn captures the slipperiness of words. I'm going to quote her. I have often mistrusted the spoken word. You give a quick tug on the line and out they come from the dark continent of the mind, those little rafts of sound that jostle together, shoulder to shoulder, that are supposed to be able to give shape to what you really think, feel, or know. But words easily miss the point. They drift off in the wrong direction, or they insist on providing a clear shape for something that by its nature is lost when it's pinned down. Physics supplies a nice analogy for what each method tells us something different. The light telescope detects planets and stars, but it can't detect the dark matter that makes up most of the universe. And that dark matter is described with a vocabulary very different from the one used to describe the information that we get from the light telescope. I'm suggesting to you that the descriptions produced by trained introspection are incommensurable with the descriptions that we get from observing behavior or doing a PET scan of a human brain. You can't translate one set of descriptions into the other. One cannot translate the products of my introspections of how I feel about the war in Iraq into sentences that will describe the fMRI scan of my brain while I'm engaging in the same thoughts in Ritchie's laboratory. The physicist von Helmholtz thought he could describe a Bach cantata with a vocabulary of sine waves and spectra. And Brahms, who was having a conversation with von Helmholtz, disagreed. He said, I would use the vocabulary of form, counterpoint, and harmony. You and I would probably use words like elegant, aesthetic, or relaxing. No individual would be able to discover that one area of the brain is more active when we see a robin fly from a tree, while a different area is active when we notice that it has a red breast. No, nor can introspection reveal the subtle distortions of our past experiences, executed in the service of creating a coherence that was absent in those experiences. Finally, and this is very important, I hope it comes up in our discussion, the Buddhist scholars told us that their ethical premises influence their introspective activity. It is impossible to separate them. But that means that an individual with a different ethical position will have a different set of introspective experiences about this very same event. I do believe, however, that trained introspection can reveal subtleties of perception and feeling that no other current scientific method can discover. That's why I came to this meeting, and therefore this information is useful. And I agree with Eric Lander and the consensus in this meeting that that evidence should be incorporated into our studies of human psychology. And I know you, welcome the contribution of Buddhist scholars to this mission. They have something important to tell us about mind and perhaps brain. Although their insights are not more valid, or if you prefer, more true than any other corpus. Trained introspection is a valuable source of evidence, another instrument to be added to those of the geneticist, the cell biologist, the neuroscientist, the historian, the psychologist, the sociologist, the anthropologist, the novelist, the poet, and all others who wish to be wiser observers of the phenomena that we can never know completely. Thank you.